From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
This is a moral mission for me. I can see that illegal migration is creating division across our country.
It's not unusual to hear a Home Secretary wringing their hands about small boats. But what is unusual is to hear a Labour Home Secretary promising the biggest overhaul of Britain's asylum system since World War II, with a raft of radical new policies.
People are angry about something that is real. It is my job, therefore, to think of a proper solution to this very real problem.
Can Shabana Mahmood bring the country and her party with her? It's already causing an outcry among Labour backbenchers.
Do you think that policies like this are a betrayal of Labour values?
Absolutely, I do. Some of the proposals that have been leaked, they do sound very reform in their nature.
Something Reform are very aware of.
When we were using similar language 2 months ago, the Labour Party was describing us as racist bigots. I mean, talk about hypocrisy.
So will the Home Secretary win over the doubters? And if this new policy shift was inspired by the Danish government's radical approach to asylum laws, how did it work out there? The story today, Labour's asylum gamble.
I am Ben Clatworthy and I'm Whitehall editor at The Times.
Well, Ben, I know you've been watching events in Parliament all afternoon. We've finally had the big announcement from the Home Secretary, this raft of measures that we've been hearing about for days now. Talk us through them.
Shabana Mahmood has stood up and unveiled a raft of measures today that she hopes will bring down illegal migration.
Today, we have published Restoring Order and Control, a new statement on our asylum policy.
Crucially, she wants to make it much harder for people who come to the UK illegally to stay. And that includes doubling to 20 years the length of time it would take a refugee to be eligible to apply for leave to remain in the country.
We will do so by making refugee status temporary, not permanent. A grant of refugee status will last 2.5 years, not 5. It will be renewed only if it is impossible for a refugee to return home. Permanent settlement will now come at 20 years, not 5.
But also, the government wants to ramp up family returns.
We must remove those who have failed asylum claims, regardless of who they are. Today, we are not removing family groups, even when we know that their home country is perfectly safe.
Basically, families end up in these sort of legal loopholes and appealing the decisions and are able to stay for many years. And this is sort of probably the most controversial bit. They say that they will start deporting families whose asylum claims have been rejected. And that is definitely the bit that we're going to hear a lot of about from Labour MPs in the coming days.
So, Ben, that's about families who've come over on small boats but have had their asylum appeals rejected, so that they did not meet the criteria. And what about families and individuals from countries where they were accepted as asylum seekers? So, for example, Syria, but those countries are now have had a change of government. I mean, where does that leave them?
So this is another one of the sweeping changes here. Basically, the government say that if there has been a regime change in a refugee's home country, the UK's approach to that country should change too.
We will never return anyone to be tortured in their home country. But the definition of degrading treatment has expanded into the realm of the ridiculous.
And Shabana Mahmood says that a number of Syrian people have supported their return home to Syria on a voluntary basis since the end of Assad's regime. And that is something she's saying will be replicated in other countries. If the UK decides that a refugee who was granted asylum, but then their country becomes safe again, that they will be removed and given that financial assistance to go back to their country. And again, the rhetoric here is that if people refuse to go back to countries that are then deemed safe, that again, the government would pursue the option of enforced removal.
One of the most controversial measures that we know that backbenchers are getting very exercised about already is the idea of sort of a jewellery and possessions law. Just talk us through what the changes mean.
Yes, so there was a briefing by the Home Office over the weekend to newspapers that included talk of people with assets having those assets removed in order to cover the cost of their keep effectively in the UK. Now, where that got sort of overspun was the idea of jewellery, and people thought that if a refugee came with a nice gold bracelet, that might be seized and sold to help cover the costs. And actually, that is not true. In the policy paper, there is no mention of jewellery specifically. What there is, though, is mention of assets, such as cars, e-bikes or cash.
So those with income or assets will have to contribute to the cost of their stay. This will end the absurdity that we currently experience, where an asylum seeker receiving £800 each month from his family and who had recently acquired an Audi was receiving free housing at the taxpayer's expense.
The government will also step up efforts to recover support costs if a migrant fails to declare their assets on arrival. And the idea, again, is that the UK will look less attractive to people coming over.
There's also just a weakening of family rights in the appeal process. Tell us a bit about that.
They want to clamp down on the number of appeals that a migrant can make if they are refused asylum. They are also going to look at the ways that migrants can use Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which enshrines the right to a family life. Legislation will instruct judges to prioritise public safety and the national interest of controlling illegal immigration over an individual's family rights. So these are some quite sweeping changes and a very bold ambition that the Home Secretary has set out.
And is she able to do that, given our current treaties?
The issue that she is going to face is that we are still in the European Convention of Human Rights and that actually international courts could get involved. And there has been a lot of MPs today saying, well, yes, good luck, but you're going to find this will all get bogged down in the same legal challenges that previous governments and this government have experienced.
And Ben, the changes won't just affect people applying for asylum, they also affect other countries. Tell us about some of the measures that the Home Secretary has introduced that will affect visa rights for other countries, for example.
The Home Secretary announced the first 3 countries that will face effectively Trump-style sanctions. Those will be Angola, Namibia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo.
That if they do not comply with international rules and norms, we will impose visa penalties on them. And I am sending a wider message here. Unless other countries heed this lesson, further sanctions will follow.
And they will face a sliding scale of visa penalties if their governments do not, in her words, rapidly improve cooperation on removals. And that is a very right-wing policy. It's taken straight out of the textbook that we've seen Donald Trump using. And for a Labour Home Secretary to stand up and announce these measures is what some of her own MPs are very nervous about. And actually, it's interesting watching how the measures are being welcomed by Tories on the opposition benches.
So that's the view on the ground in Westminster. But many of these changes have been inspired by a very different parliament, the one in Denmark. So what has the Danish government been doing, and how effective has it been? One of my colleagues has been finding out.
I'm Fraser Nelson. I'm a columnist for The Times.
And Fraser, this feels like a big moment in Westminster.
This is Labour's big response to reform. We're getting in Shabana Mahmood, a new Home Secretary, who is distinguishing herself as a kind of get tough. I wouldn't exactly say hardliner, but if you look at the language she's using, it's intended to ruffle feathers, to show there's a big departure. And it's intended to win back these Labour voters who have been drifting away. I mean, we've seen Labour absolutely tank in the opinion polls. And we've also seen the small boat problem become the most visible of the government's border control issues. So they're trying to say, yes, we are going to crack down on it based on the Danish model of a hardline approach to immigration and asylum.
One country where we've sort of seen a vibe shift happen and where Shabana Mahmood seems to have drawn quite a lot of inspiration from is Denmark. For those who haven't been following it closely, which is probably a lot of people, just remind us, I mean, what exactly has been happening there? Tell us a bit about the government and their vibe shift.
Denmark's Mette Frederiksen is perhaps the most electorally successful centre-left leader in Europe and the originator of the centre-left hardline position on migration. Now, she was doing this years ago, back in 2016-17, and at the time, Denmark's populists had sort of 20% vote share. It was a similar story to reform, but then we saw something extraordinary happen. The populists went from 20% to about 3% in the last election in the polls, completely collapsed. And the centre-left came up with some policies that probably would be too much even for Nigel Farage right now.
Wow.
Now, it started, interestingly, with an argument, a political argument, saying, look, we believe in the welfare state, we're left-wingers, and we also believe in national cohesion, but we accept there is a tension between the welfare state and an immigration model and asylum model. And we will put the welfare state ahead of this.
So basically, the immigration and asylum seekers coming in are too much of a strain on the...
A whole bunch of things. Firstly, they cost a lot of money to keep them in these various processing centres, and they're claiming welfare. There's also cohesion issues as well. So the fundamental difference is that Britain sees asylum and refugees as a duty to be discharged, that we're a rich country, that we have got a duty to take in X many people a year. Denmark thinks, no, asylum, we want to cut down to zero. And this is going to be a left-wing cause. And by and large, they have got away with it, although it sounds impossible to British ears.
Just explain that, because, as we've been saying, while Denmark is an inspiration for the current Labour government, they are so much more extreme. Even Nigel Farage in this country would be quite shocked by some of their policies, and yet they seem to be selling them to the public as part of a left-wing agenda. What's their argument?
I think if you take away our current notion of right and left, in Britain we tend to think about right-wing as being hawkish in immigration and asylum and left-wing as being let them all in. Now, you don't see that in Scandinavia. They will talk about, it's left-wing to think, okay, we believe that the nation-state is a cohesive unit which serves a social function. It is there so the rich can help the poor. It is there to help people grow. And this nation-state needs to be protected from too much immigration because that can undermine the nation state. It can undermine the social contract. But the interesting thing is the Scandinavians have come to this approach. The Danish centre-left came to it about 8 years ago. The Swedish centre-left came to it about the last sort of 4 or 5 years. But they are now where I suspect Labour is heading. I think that what Shabana Mahmood is thinking is there's no reason why this cannot be a left-wing narrative, although she is not going the full Danish. She's only going about a third of the way there.
Talk us through some of those policy areas that are similar.
So there's not going to be no sort of ghetto laws. And the Danish have been very hawkish on what they call the ghettos, parts of Denmark which are predominantly immigrants. Mette Frederiksen, she decided to say, right, if we want a coherent society, we need to insist on integration. So we're going to disperse these ghettos. There are 12 of them right now. We want to cut them down to zero. So these are things which Shabana Mahmood would never think of doing. I mean, in Britain, we wouldn't tell people where to live. Not even Nigel Farage is wanting to do that. There's going to be no rules like the Danish have. Unless you've got a job, you're not going to be given settled status. Shabana Mahmood's going partly down that road. She's saying if you do get a job, you might get settled status in 10 years rather than 20. So she's doing it with incentives rather than with bans. There's also, she's proposing a refugees kind of a route to work, where if you do learn English, if you do pass integration tests, if you do work, then you can get on the fast track. But if you don't learn English, then you still will get there. It will just take you 20 years rather than 10. perhaps one of the more controversial things is that she intends to tell refugees who own high-value assets that they need to sell them if they're going to keep their free accommodation.
Talk us through this, because this is something that the Danes looked at too. They introduced a version of this. They sort of called it the jewellery law for a while. This came in after the Syrian refugees started arriving, and that it was initially supposed to take any kind of expensive jewellery or any assets that they had when they arrived.
That law is still live. It's been live for 8 years, so technically you can take anything. And it's interesting, when the Ukrainians came, it was waived for them, but it wasn't waived for the Syrians. Now, it doesn't
It sort of got watered down a bit. There was a bit of an outcry, and I think they sort of made exemptions for wedding rings or for heirlooms.
For sentimental value, but that's again at the discretion of the person doing the confiscating. But the biggest concession they made is that this doesn't actually happen. It's intended to be a kind of keep-out signal, saying, look, apply for asylum anywhere you want, but not here in Denmark, because we've got the toughest regime. And that has worked. It's got the numbers down by 95%. But it's interesting that Britain's even adopting a version of that. Now, Shabana Mahmood, as I understand it, is thinking more like e-bikes and things like cars rather than jewellery. But nonetheless, it's saying that if you want free accommodation and we find you've got assets, we expect you to sell those assets.
They also had a shift in terms of the rules around families of people who are sort of seeking refugee status. Tell us about that, and what is it that Shabana Mahmood is going to be doing?
Well, Denmark has got a pretty hardline approach to family reunification. That is to say, if you're a refugee and you've arrived here and you've got your settled status saying, OK, I'd now like to take certain family members over here, Denmark makes you, first of all, wait for 3 years. Then you've got to be both 24 years old at least. You're ruled out if you've claimed benefits at any time in the last 3 years. And you've got to meet various integration conditions. Now, this is the interesting thing. I'm told we're going to be as tough, if not tougher, than Denmark when it comes to the tests set for family reunification for refugees. Can't wait to read the small print on this, because it's not clear to me how Britain is going to effectively end family reunification for refugees, although I'm told that is effectively what Shabana Mahmood has in mind.
As you said, Denmark and Sweden basically made zero asylum their target policy. That isn't happening here. Talk us through the differences, because Shabana Mahmood is also, she's not pulling out of the ECHR. You know, there are clearly some red lines that they still have.
Yes, and when she's asked about this, she does make some encouraging points. I say encouraging because I would place myself on the more liberal end of this debate. She says that Britain is always going to be a country that accepts refugees, and she wants to open more safe and legal routes. Now, one of the problems right now is that they're very difficult to get here legally, because we've got so many, tens of thousands coming here illegally. That is taking the bandwidth where the illegal settlements should be. So she is saying that she wants to open more of these legal routes. So she wants to do bad cop, good cop, as it were, on that. So she's saying, yes, we are going to make it a lot tougher to come here as a refugee, but we're also going to make it easier and open more settled status. And I've always thought that a Labour Party led by a lawyer, Keir Starmer, with a lawyer, Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, should be able to take the lead in Europe almost. Because we can see, not just in Denmark, but in Italy, in Austria, in Sweden, lots of European countries are crying out for a new version of the 1951 Refugee Convention, an updated version to think, OK, this system is not working, but not only is it not working, it's undermining our democracies. It's fueling the rise of the far right everywhere. The Germans quite often talk about societal collapse. So we could come up with a model that others might follow. Because I do believe this needs to start with argument. We need to start with first principles. Who are we as a country? What are the problems we're facing? What duty do we believe we have? And of course, we owe first duty to our own people. But that's not to say we owe nothing to those outside. So let's have a conversation about how we best help them, how we most effectively help them. But for this, you need a mindset where you don't feel hidebound by the various treaties and the legal architecture that we inherited in the last few decades. You need to start from scratch. I mean, given that British lawyers were behind the ECHR in the first place, I like to think there are a whole bunch of far-sighted, progressive English lawyers who can come up with a new settlement now. I've given up thinking that the English lawyer who's number 10 might be able to do it, but perhaps his Home Secretary might.
You told us that in Denmark they made zero asylum their target. How has that worked out?
Well, this is Fredriksen's idea. It's an explicit zero asylum policy. And last year granted asylum to just 864 people. They've cut it by 95%, so that's pretty close to zero. I mean, in Britain, we had over 100,000 people apply for asylum last year. So that's the second lowest figure for 4 decades. Denmark's also refused the UN's quota of 500 resettlement refugees annually. And it's funny that they've signed the Refugee Convention, but they still point blank refuse to go along with it. So quite often you see them in open breach of international obligations. In Britain, you'd never get a minister proposing something that the civil service say is against the law.
Fraser, you were explaining how in Denmark there was this real vibe shift with policies. Some of them were so extreme they've become the law, but they haven't actually been applied because they seemed so extreme. Is that what this raft of policies here is about? Is it about the vibe shift, and will it shift the dial in terms of the small boats and all the problems that the Home Secretaries for years now have been facing?
My own suspicion is that it won't shift the dial on small boat arrivals. It will make things more complicated in due course, but the legal wheels in Britain move incredibly slowly. I think it will be some time before we see any real effect of this. So that's why I think it's not so much procedural. It is a vibe shift. It is intending to say to the British public, I'm a new Home Secretary, there's a new sheriff in town, and I take this very seriously. It will also be intended to say to those coming to Britain, don't think we're a soft touch. But I think this is the start of a process. I think the big change will come, for example, if she pulls out of the 1951 Refugee Convention, which I think is a reasonable chance of doing that. You're starting to see people like David Blunkett and Jack Straw, former Labour Home Secretaries, say, look, this legal architecture isn't working. We need to do more than just tweak it. We need to pull out completely. Now, the Tories want to pull out of the European Convention of Human Rights, which I think is a red herring. Because if you look at the asylum seekers who are appealing, they're not really appealing on ECHR grounds. Let's remember that Denmark and Sweden are members of the EU, let alone the ECHR. It shows this is government competence. And the fault line, of course, will lie within the Labour Party itself. We've got Lord Hermer, the Attorney General. He will not like any of this one bit. And you're going to get some Labour backbenchers who are going to think, oh my God, she's imitating Farage. They'll be thinking, no, I've spent 15 years in opposition where I was slagging off the Tories for being too cruel and hard. That is the problem here. Because Labour spent these years in opposition, and the Danish Social Democrats spent them in government, the Danish Social Democrats have been thinking, okay, how can we basically move towards the public opinion on in immigration and in welfare policy? Labour has been, how can we oppose the Tories? If the Tories want to oppose welfare, we're going to say that's really cruel and heartless. If the Tories want to do Rwanda or anything, we're going to say that's really cruel and heartless. Now, all of a sudden, they're in government and they're doing the things which every instinct tells them is cruel and heartless. So that kind of U-turn on messaging in thinking would be very difficult for the Labour Party, especially those who are now fearing the rise of the Greens.
Labour is clearly making a pitch for the voters they think are defecting to reform. How is Reform greeting these measures?
Both Reform and the Tories are saying these are wishy-washy measures which don't amount to very much. And she still wants to stay in the ECHR, therefore she's not serious. Now, this is a new song the Tories are singing because even they wanted to stay in the ECHR until a few weeks ago. But they'll be saying, look, why go for the imitation? Why not come for the real thing? But the great weapon of this Labour government is that it's still got 3.5 years left. If they are able to tackle immigration, and I can actually see in 2 years' time, things like the Shabana Mahmood reforms working. I can see migration heading towards net zero, and I can see this being far less an issue at the next general election than it is right now, and Reform having less of a song to sing. The number of immigrants leaving Britain right now is absolutely huge. The numbers have quadrupled. There's now almost 400,000 immigrants are leaving permanently every single year. So a combination of the Reform Shabana Mahmood is talking about and the emigration wave about to take place does point to this being a solvable problem for Labour.
And just finally, sort of stepping back, is this a permanent shift of the spectrum across Europe? If we are seeing traditionally very liberal, very left-wing parties now sort of being the advocates of much stronger policy on asylum, has there been a vibe shift that is irreversible?
I don't believe that politics is going to extremes necessarily. I just think that what can happen is it's human nature that one's political view comes to form, typically in early life, in your 20s or something, and people tend to cling to that. And the problem there, of course, is that the world changes. You get different things. And when we were knocking down borders in the 90s, nobody imagined people would be on the move in the way that they are now. But demographic change was never envisaged. So you get a whole bunch of new problems, serious problems, and they get ignored because the old parties are still applying their old framework and been thinking, oh, no, that's taboo, we can't be doing this, and also not recognising things like, for example, the welfare state dysfunction, that was never envisaged by... I mean, if William Beveridge was around today, he'd be absolutely appalled to see 5,000 people a day being written off into sickness benefit. And thinking that that's outrageous is not an extreme position. Thinking that having tens of thousands of small boat arrivals is an absolute outrage and it should be stopped immediately isn't an extreme position. So I think the public actually are not extremists in this. It's just that the politicians have failed to realise that the policies that worked 30 years ago won't work now, and that they need to pick new tools. And just because their opponents, i.e. the new parties, the political entrepreneurs, if you want to call it that, like Zach Polanski and Nigel Farage, just because they're saying something, it doesn't make it wrong. So this isn't so much the centre ground of Westminster, but the common ground the parties should share with the public. And this is all about finding that common ground. And I think the Scandinavian left have done that more than the British left. But I think what we see now is Shabana Mahmood out on a bit of a hunt to find that common ground. It may make many in a party uncomfortable, but if Labour's going to stand any chance of the next election, that's where it's got to be.
That was Fraser Nelson, Times columnist, and before that, Ben Clatworthy, Times Whitehall editor. The producers today were Olivia Case, Michaela Arneson, and Harry Stott. The executive producer was Kate Lamble. Sound design was by Tom Birchall, and theme composition was by Maula Seto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.